For several years now, I've thought quite a bit about modern humanity's complete dependence upon these massive centralized systems that can very, very easily break at any given moment. Our food system, water system, electricity, internet, self-service, just bam, gone in a moment. During Hurricane Helene, I saw all of these systems break down, excluding food. And they haven't even all come back online yet, almost a month later in Western North Carolina. Cell service was super spotty for, I think it was maybe the first 2 weeks, I can't remember. But on day number 1, I had to call 911 because I smelled this terrifying amount of natural gas. Like it was the most scared I was throughout the whole ordeal. It took me 4 times before I was able to get a hold of 911. The first 2 calls, the line was completely dead. Thankfully, that gas smell ended up going away. I think that it was the propane tanks that were floating down the river behind my house. As for running water, just for context, today's October 23rd. Helene hit us on September 27th. My running water was restored 17 days after it went out. However, the water that was restored is super brown and gross, and I'm not even using it. According to the county, 80% of Asheville gets all of our water from the same exact reservoir. And while Asheville's not a massive city, I just looked at the population, we're just under 100,000 people. So that's a lot of people who still don't have clean running water almost a month later. As for electricity, thankfully, mine was restored 9 days after it went out.
It just came on!
But there's still people today who haven't had their electricity restored. And my internet was down until a couple days ago, but there are also people who still don't have internet restored. We have this belief that because these massive centralized systems have always worked for us, that they will always continue to work for us. But that is simply not true. These systems are actually extremely fragile, but most people don't recognize that, and so they don't have any kind of alternative way of supporting themselves if the systems go down. So many people don't even know how to survive on their own if these systems were completely taken out. Thankfully, we were really lucky here because not everybody lost their water, not everybody lost their electricity, so people were sharing. We also had tons of supplies and support come in from around the country and even Canada. I personally was really well prepared for this, but I was not 100% prepared. There were several gaps in my preparation plan that I am now going to fill after this. Hopefully you're either prepared or you're now inspired to do some preparation for yourself because it's necessary. You really have no idea when anything's going to hit. We didn't know that this was going to hit and take out a significant portion of our infrastructure. I am not a prepping pro at all, but I'm going to tell you how I prepared for this and what I wish I had prepared for this, just based off of my personal experience during Hurricane Helene. The first and most important thing to prepare is drinking water, and I just got that situation dialed in earlier this year. I had 57 gallons of water on hand for me and Maggie at the start of this, and I have needed it. And because I don't know how long this is going to continue, I've continued to buy water or get free water when it's offered to me. I use water bricks for my backup water storage, and they're great because you can stack them and you can stuff them in a corner, or you can very easily slide them underneath a couch or a bed. Second thing is any kind of life-sustaining medication. I personally am not on any meds, but little Maggie has medicine for her epilepsy and heart issues, so I have a 60-day supply of that on hand at any given time. Next up is food. I didn't personally need to get into my emergency food supply, but I did need to get into Maggie's backup food, so I was super grateful that I had it on hand. I just buy things that I use regularly. I have dried rice, dried beans, and some canned tuna fish, and different things like that that I rotate through. So I'll actually use it and then I'll rebuy it so it never expires. And then I have my bulk foods stored in these airtight bags with oxygen absorbers, and then I put them into a food grade bucket. Another thing to think about is how you're going to cook the food. Thankfully, I have a gas stove and the gas line was uninterrupted throughout this whole thing, so I was able to cook on my stove normally. However, because we didn't have electricity, I had to use a lighter to light the stove. I also have a camp stove and additional fuel canisters, And then I have a pot that I can use to cook over the fire if need be, like if the gas line was cut or something. I didn't have to worry about this through the hurricane because it was pretty warm out, but I also bought myself an indoor propane heater a couple years ago because the houses that I've lived in haven't had a fireplace or wood stove available. So I wanted something to have on hand that I could heat up my home in case of emergency if the power went out and it was freezing. The thing with the propane heater is although it's indoor, you still have to have a window cracked to vent it out. This next thing is more of an investment, but I'm super grateful that I had it. I bought myself a solar powered generator a couple years ago, and while I didn't have enough sunshine to really keep everything maintained, like my freezer did not stay frozen for 9 days, but I lost very little food throughout it. And most people here either had to eat through all their food or they lost it because they didn't have any kind of backup electrical supply. And the solar was great too because the gas stations were intense. Like that was a place that I wanted to avoid because that's where the arguments and all of the drama was breaking out. And it was really nice to not have to go to a gas station and just have my solar powered generator plug my fridge into. One thing I did wish that I had was an alternative battery that I could use to charge small electronics that had a hand crank on it. So I purchased one of those and I've been playing around with it, and really it's something that you need to regularly charge. They say to charge it every 6 months, like on an actual electrical outlet, because the solar and the hand crank, they really don't do the job to charge it fully back up. They basically just keep it from completely dying. So if you're going to have it in case of emergency, I would buy it and then charge it once every 6 months to the full. I had actually just bought myself a bunch of solar flashlights and an emergency radio with solar and hand crank option just a couple months before this, and I was really, really grateful that I had those. The emergency radio was necessary at first because we didn't have any kind of connection to the internet, so we had absolutely no idea what was going on unless we listened to the radio. All this stuff that I'm talking about, by the way, I'm going to attach it in a link down below the video so you can just go through and buy it off of Amazon if you want, or you can try and find it locally. But I do suggest that if you buy any of this less expensive stuff, you really test it out before the return date because it's inexpensive, which means it's cheaply made and things do break. Unfortunately, my emergency radio, which was amazing for the time that I needed it, it had 2 things go wrong with it just last week. So test these things out a bunch before the return period in case you need to exchange or return it. If you don't have a bunch of 5-gallon buckets laying around like I do, I highly recommend you go get yourself some because in an emergency, you are probably going to need at least 3, 4, 5-gallon buckets. I have always been a fan of the 5-gallon bucket, but now it holds a very special place in my heart as I have continued to use 5-gallon buckets every single day over the past month. Mainly I've used them for different water things, but I've used them to carry various things. And I've also used 5-gallon buckets for my composting toilet system that I've had to use because trying to maintain a toilet without regular access to water is disgusting. I recommend baby wipes to help clean yourself if you don't have access to running water. But if you do have access to any kind of clean water that you can bring in, I really recommend this camping shower. It feels like absolute luxury after baby wiping and sponge bathing. This thing is amazing. That I didn't start using until I had access to a friend's house where I was able to actually go get clean water and bring it back to my house. And I've had to use a ton of paper towels for various cleaning things. I don't typically like using paper towels, but you need paper towels when you don't have running water. Another thing that I've had to use quite a bit that just wouldn't be super obvious thinking about emergency preparation is my respirator. This would be good too to prevent smoke inhalation, but I've had to use it a lot for hurricane cleanup because everything in the flooded areas is super toxic and moldy, and so you don't want to breathe that stuff in. And I mean, it smells terrible too. So it's not like I'm just imagining things. It's like I'm going to die if I'm breathing this in regularly. Other preparation things that I didn't actually need. I have a pretty decent first aid kit at my house. So I would have that stuff on hand, especially because so many stores are closed And then it's harder to get medical treatment through this. So if you have just basic first aid on hand and a way to clean your wounds, because without running water, you really have to work to keep wounds clean so they don't get infected. I also have some emergency antibiotics and other backup medication that I got from this company called Jace Medical. And I'll link them down below too because it's a pretty awesome company. I'd say that the biggest gap that I found in my emergency preparation was not having water for cleaning. When I found out that our water system was going down, I filled up some buckets, but it just wasn't enough to do much of anything with, other than washing hands and doing some sponge bathing. I also set up a makeshift water catchment system, but the water that came off of my roof was so disgusting and dirty that it was just unusable. And I tried so many different ways to try and filter that water with no success. I have attempted to filter the rain catchment water so many different ways, so many different times. I made a biofilter today, but the problem is the rocks and the sand were really dirty, and I tried to rinse them off as best I could, but they just made the water worse. Apparently something like that you need to run for 30 days before the water comes out clean, but yeah, I'm really tired of being so just disgusting. I feel so gross right now. I have a Berkey water filtration system and I've used that a bunch throughout all of this, but the problem is without a pre-filter, it gets really backed up and so the water won't filter through it. Another gap in preparation that I found is that I did not have any emergency cash on hand. I used to have a backup stash of emergency cash, but I ended up using it and not replacing it. And so now I'm always going to have some backup cash on hand because for maybe 2 weeks, I don't know. It's all kind of a blur now, but for a while, you couldn't get anything if you didn't have cash. The other gap that I have in my preparation is I don't have anything prepared for a potential evacuation. So I don't have an emergency go bag. I don't have a list of where things are that I want to take with me. When I lived in Colorado, forest fires were such a problem there. I had this list prepared. Okay, this is everything that I want to take with me if I have to evacuate, and this is where everything is, because when you're in the moment in that situation and it's a lot harder to think. Like when I was smelling that gas, I started preparing for evacuation because I wasn't going to stay if that gas smell continued at the strength that it was at, because I really have no interest in blowing up. But I was starting to think like, oh gosh, what do I want to take? And I was having to go around my house and look for things. And it's really hard when you're in that emergency situation to be able to use your brain and figure things out. So like if you have a list that you can read, okay, all of my family photos, they're located here. I want to grab them and put them in the house. Here's where my laptop is. Here's where this and that is. It's just a lot better. So that is another gap that I'm going to take care of. That list and then the emergency go bag. So I'm sure there are a million other ways that you could prepare for an emergency. But just based off of my personal experience with Hurricane Helene, this covers the basics of everything that I needed. I really suggest that you prepare beforehand because if you're prepared, you can be a lot calmer. You can feel a lot safer. I have to say, when the water went out, I was a little bit nervous because I didn't know what was going to happen with everybody else, but I knew that I had a personal supply that I could keep for myself and I could also share with my closest neighbors. But it's not something that you can share with everybody. So if everybody is prepared, then the situation can stay a lot calmer and more peaceful, which it thankfully did here in Asheville. We have a really great community. So thanks for watching and happy preparing.